This is the Survey of Human Systems. For the AP exam in May, you need to know all three of these systems: the immune system, the endocrine system, and the nervous system. For the lesson, you only need to know the one that you were assigned. This video will cover the basic material needed for the exam in May, but I expect you to know more than just this for your lesson. You're going to need to know supporting detail so that you can teach your group about your system. What that supporting material is going to be up to you. The immune system is going to begin on slide 13, the endocrine system on slide 23, and I will start with the nervous system. The nervous system is composed of the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which are all the nerves of the rest of the body. The brain, of course, is the control center, so it interprets information that comes in and makes decisions on that information. The spinal cord is the transfer. It takes the information from the peripheral nervous system, from all the nerves in the rest of the body, sends it to the brain. When the brain has interpreted it and made its decision, it will send it back out through the spinal cord, and then the body responds. The peripheral nervous system is based on the individual nerve, or the neuron. The neurons have three main parts. We have the soma, or the cell body. The cell body holds the nucleus, and the nucleus acts like it does in any other cell, controlling how the cell functions. The soma also interprets the information that comes in from the dendrites. The dendrites collect electrical information from nearby neurons. It's sent into the soma integrates it and sends it out to nearby neurons through the axon. Those are the main parts of the neuron. We'll talk about the other smaller parts in upcoming slides. There are three types of neurons, each with their own special job. The sensory neurons are attached to the senses, the taste buds, the fingertips, the eyes, and they detect stimuli from the outside world through our five senses. The motor neurons are attached to the muscles, and they react to what the sensory neurons have detected. So, for example, you touch something hot, you feel that through the sensory neurons, and that makes the muscles contract and you pull your hand away. The third type is the interneuron, and these are found within the brain and the spinal cord. They provide complex reflexes, things that make you do more than just move your fingers. The ones that make you move your fingers, your hands, your arm, all the way back to your shoulder. And they also control functions like learning and memory. The central nervous system, that brain and spinal cord combination I mentioned earlier, will connect all the information from the sensory neurons, the motor neurons, and the interneurons together to allow your body to respond to the environment in complex ways. We've covered the three main portions of the neuron: the cell body or soma, the dendrites, and the axon. These parts don't work alone, however. They're supported by the neuroglia. The neuroglia work in association with the axon to form an insulating cover. That cover is going to improve the efficiency of the electrical impulse that's going to move down the axon. We're going to begin with the Schwann cell. The Schwann cell is a specialized cell that creates a protein called myelin. That myelin is going to actually create the material of that insulation. Together, the Schwann cell and the protein creates the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath has gaps in it, here and here and here. Those are called the nodes of Ranvier. These will actually accelerate the impulse as it moves down this axon and actually improve efficiency even more than it was before. To understand how nerves are transmitted, you have to kind of picture this in your head. All cells are attached to a nerve or to a group of nerves. For information to pass to and from the cell, nerve impulse have to pass from that cell through the nerve and back. So in other words, I'm going to go back to this previous picture. We would have a cell up here. It would receive a stimulus from the environment. It would send that stimulus information through the dendrite into the soma, where it's going to be integrated and directed through the axon to the appropriate either additional nerve or muscle or brain or spinal cord, wherever that information needs to go, so that this area over here can interpret it and then send a response back over here. Then through there, back to the cell, and then the cell knows how to behave. In the previous slide, I mentioned that information is passed from one neuron to another. In order for that to happen, it must pass through the synapse. The synapse is a tiny gap between the dendrites of one neuron and the dendrites of another neuron, or between the dendrites of a neuron and the dendrites of a cell. The part of the neuron that receives the initial stimulus is called the presynaptic neuron. Pre, because it comes before the synapse. So it is the one that will transmit the nerve impulse. The postsynaptic neuron, the one that comes after the synapse, is going to receive that impulse and send it on to the appropriate destination. The transmission of information between the cell, the neuron, the synapse, the neuron, and the central nervous system, and then back to that cell, results in a response to a stimulus. That response can stimulate an organism to do something like run, or it can inhibit the organism or prevent them from doing something like freezing them in place. So here's an example. Way over here is your finger, and you put your finger on the stove. The sensory neuron in your finger will feel that heat. It'll send that information here into the dendrite. The presynaptic neuron, it's going to say, hey, there's something going on and it's hot. It'll move through that neuron across the synapse into the postsynaptic neuron and on into the spinal cord, which then will tell the brain, hey, there's something going on in the finger, it feels hot. The brain's going to interpret that information, bring it back to the spinal cord. The spinal cord will send it back through those neurons, through that synapse, back through the neuron, back to the finger, and the finger will respond because the muscle will contract and it will be taken off the heat. That's the entire process of nerve transmission. We're now going to look at the tricky part of nerve transmission. We're going to look at the chemistry of what makes that nerve impulse move along the axon. We're going to start here where it says polarized or resting. When a neuron is at rest, it's more negative on the inside than on the outside. So you see here we've got all these negatives in the middle and all these positives out here. This condition is described as polarized. In a polarized or resting condition, a neuron does not have a stimulus going through it. It's just sitting, waiting for something to happen. That something, or a stimulus caused by the outside world, if it's strong enough that a response is required, that change, that stimulus, is called an action potential, because it causes the potential, the electrical potential inside to change. And so we're going to go from all negatives on the inside to all positives on the inside. When the inside of the axon is more positive than the outside, the nerve cell is described as being depolarized. We're now going to talk about the actual movement of that nerve energy, the action potential. Whenever a cell receives a stimulus, it sends energy down the axon. That energy is electricity. Electricity is negative. Negative energy is always going to be pulled toward positive energy, which is why we are changing that potential from negative to positive. In order for that to happen, a stimulus must be received by the neuron. So we have a stimulus here. It's going to go into the dendrite. The dendrite is going to send it into the soma. The soma is going to determine that a response is needed, and it's going to determine that this is an action potential, that the axon potential needs to be changed. It's going to move into the axon. Channels in the neuron are going to open up, and sodium ions are going to rush in. This is going to make our cell more positive and draw that electrical energy in and create the nerve impulse. This is the depolarization that I talked about, more positive on the inside. It's going to keep making that inside more positive and keep drawing that nerve impulse down the axon and off to the next neuron. Once the electrical impulse has passed by, the sodium channels will close and potassium channels will open. The potassium ions will flow out, and that will make the interior negative again, and so the movement of the electrical energy will stop. However, we are not at that polarized resting anymore. We have the sodium and potassium ions on the wrong side. The cell will correct that by slowly moving the sodium atoms back in and the potassium ions back out by using the sodium-potassium pump. We talked about that briefly in Chapter 5 when we talked about the transmembrane proteins. Let's go over the idea of nerve transmission one more time before we move on. We're going to start at step number 1. This is a polarized cell, meaning that it is at rest. If you look at the inside of the axon, it is more negative than the outside. There is no action potential or no nerve impulse moving through it. When we move to step 2, we have an action potential. This means that somewhere over here, a cell received a stimulus. It sent information through the dendrites into the soma. The soma decided that yes, a response was going to be needed, and so an action potential or a nerve impulse was created. Remember, these action potentials are electricity, and electricity is negative. To get this to move through the axon, we need to change these negative symbols into positive ones, because the negative electricity will be drawn to the positive ions inside the axon. This is going to happen as the cell opens ion channels through the membrane. This will allow sodium ions, which are positive, into the axon, and the negative ions will then be replaced. This will make the inside more positive than outside. Those positives will draw the negative electricity to them and move them down the axon. This is called depolarized. When the nerve impulse has moved down the axon, as you see in 3, the cell begins to reset. The sodium channels will close and the potassium channels will open. The potassium ions will flow out and the neuron will become negative again. This negativity will keep the negative electricity from flowing backward. The cell, however, will need to be reset because the sodium and the potassium ions are now on the wrong side of the membrane. The cell will sort this out by using the sodium-potassium pump. Sodium atoms will be brought back in and potassium ions will be moved back out, returning the system to its original resting state. As a nerve impulse moves down the axon, it reaches the synapse. When it reaches the synapse, it triggers the release of a chemical called a neurotransmitter. That neurotransmitter helps the nerve impulse to cross that gap, that synapse, and move into the next neuron. There are a large number of neurotransmitters. Each one has a specific function. I'm going to tell you about 2. The first is acetylcholine, called ACH. ACH has a variety of effects on the body, depending on where it's found. If it's found in the peripheral nervous system, it will cause the muscles to contract. If it's found in the brain, it enhances our sensory perception when we wake up. It's what makes you wake up bright and cheery or wake up more slowly. And it also helps us to maintain our attention. Recent studies have suggested that ACH may be related to Alzheimer's and to depression, meaning that if you don't have enough of ACH, it may lead to one of those issues. Serotonin also has a variety of effects on the body, depending on where it's found. If found in the blood, it constricts the blood vessels to regulate homeostasis. So when you stand up quickly, serotonin will help constrict the blood vessels to maintain the correct blood pressure so that you don't faint. It also will help the blood to clot. If found in the brain, it regulates sleep, appetite, and mood. It's popularly believed that it is a contributor to our feelings of well-being and happiness. The last part of the nervous system that I'm going to cover is the brain. The structure of the human brain has evolved in such a way that it is very similar to all vertebrate brains, meaning that all vertebrate brains have the same 3 divisions. We all have a cerebellum, which is a hindbrain. The hindbrain coordinates muscular activities and maintains our balance and our posture. All vertebrates have a midbrain, or a brain stem. It controls basic body functions like eating, sleeping, and breathing. And all vertebrates have a forebrain, or a cerebrum. The cerebrum receives sensory data and sends response information to the muscles. It is also the center for association, which means putting related information together and learning. The human brain also has bilateral symmetry, which means that if you drew a line right down the center, both sides would look exactly the same. The cerebrum is the largest part of the human brain and is associated with higher brain functions, including thinking. The outermost part is called the cerebral cortex. The cortex is divided into 4 sections, or lobes. The frontal lobe is associated with reasoning, planning, problem solving, language, and the higher emotions such as empathy and altruism. Empathy is when you feel the same emotion as someone else, as in you feel sorry for someone when they're sad. Altruism, we talked about at the beginning of the year, is when you sacrifice something for the good of someone else. The parietal lobe controls movement, visual attention, and perception of pain and touch. The occipital lobe controls visual sensation and the processing of what we see. And the temporal lobe is associated with hearing, speech, memory, and emotion. Over time, the mammal's ability to learn has increased. As they have evolved, their cerebrum has increased in size as well. In addition, the cerebrum has split into right and left hemispheres. The hemispheres have different but related functions. For example, each hemisphere receives sensory input, but it comes from the opposite side of the body. So if I touch your right hand, the left hemisphere of the brain is going to receive and process that information and then send the response back to your right hand. The right hemisphere also deals more with visual activities and plays a role in putting those things together. For example, it takes visual information, puts it together and says, I recognize that object, that's a chair, or that's a car. It organizes or groups information together. The left hemisphere tends to be more analytical, so it analyzes the information that was collected by the right hemisphere and adds additional information to it. So for example, the right hemisphere sees the object and says it's a house. The left hemisphere takes that information and says, yes, not only is it a house, but it's my Uncle Bob's house. Along with the processes I just mentioned, of course, the brain controls the body. The right side controls the left side, and so on. In addition, the hemispheres also control our mental responses to the world. The right brain is best at creative and expressive tasks like the recognizing of faces, the expressing of emotions, music, and creativity. The left brain is best at tasks that involve logic, language, and analytical thinking. So when you hear someone say, I'm a right brain person, then they're usually saying that they are artistic. A left brain person is somebody who's generally more scientific or more logical or mathematical. This is the end of the nervous system portion of the Human Systems Survey.